So what would you do if the very ground beneath your feet, everything you thought was permanent and true, just crumbled? Well, today we're diving right into that moment. This is the story of how the 19th century's rock of certainty was completely shattered, creating the world we all live in today.
You know, this one line from a George Barnard Shaw play just nails the feeling that swept across an entire generation. Seriously, imagine it. Everything you believe is permanent. Your society, your values, your faith, suddenly turning to dust right under your feet. That, right there, is the story of the 20th century.
To really get the collapse, we first have to understand the rock itself. See, the Victorian world wasn't just an era with impressive institutions. It was an era that believed in its own permanence. They truly saw themselves at the absolute peak of civilization, standing on foundations that were built to last forever.
And what's really key here is the mindset. It wasn't just about believing in things like the empire or the church. No, it was about the attitude of belief itself. The core idea was you accept authority, you affirm it. You just don't question it.
And this table just lays out the coming collisions so perfectly. On one side, you've got the Victorian world, permanent, accepting, certain. And on the other, the 20th century mindset that was about to explode onto the scene. Everything's changing, everything must be questioned, and no truth is ever final. It was a head-on collision between two totally opposite ways of seeing the world.
So the next generation looked back at all that Victorian certainty and basically said this is hollow. They felt it was a set of beliefs their parents had just inherited but never really thought about for themselves. You know, kind of like wearing someone else's old clothes. They wanted convictions they had earned through their own skepticism.
But this shift in thinking didn't just happen in a vacuum. The change wasn't gentle or gradual. It was a violent upheaval, a century defined by this incredible, stunning paradox.
On the one hand, you had this amazing scientific and technological progress. I mean, think about the internal combustion engine. It gave millions of people a freedom of movement their ancestors couldn't even have dreamed of. The future looked incredibly bright.
But here's the crazy twist. That same engine of progress, it also powered the bomber plane and the tank. The same century that promised a utopia delivered 2 world wars, mass slaughter on an industrial scale, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Progress and regress, marching hand in hand.
This wasn't just one single hammer blow. It was a perfect storm. You had the scientific revolution, the deep trauma of 2 world wars, the revolt of a younger generation, the dissolution of the British Empire. All of these massive forces hit at the exact same time, shaking those Victorian foundations until they just cracked.
Now this is where it gets really fascinating. This revolution had its intellectual leaders. A new wave of writers didn't just sit back and report on the change, they actively took a hammer to the old world and all of its ideas.
This was the simple, 3-word creed of George Bernard Shaw, who was basically one of the chief heralds of this new age. Question, examine, test. It was a direct assault on that old Victorian idea of just accepting authority. This became the rallying cry for a whole new, deeply skeptical generation.
Shaw's whole philosophy was simple but absolutely explosive. Nothing, not religion, not science, not morality, should be accepted just on faith. He argued that any belief you haven't personally wrestled with and decided to accept is nothing more than a superstition. He wanted to spread what he called an interrogative habit of mind.
And this line from Shaw's play is just devastating. It's so effective. He's asking, why are we so eager to update our machines, but so terrified to update our ideas? He was demanding a complete and total modernization of society's moral and social software.
So what did all this questioning do to people? Well, writers like H.G. Wells captured the psychological result perfectly. If everything is temporary and constantly changing, then the world stops feeling like a permanent, stable home. Instead, it just feels like a temporary campsite. That deep sense of belonging was just gone.
But this whole intellectual revolution had this really unexpected consequence, one that would change art and literature forever. It created a deep, deep divide.
If you had to pick one single year where everything changed, one moment where the ground truly shifted in the literary world, it would have to be 1922.
In that one year, 2 monumental and monumentally difficult works were published, James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Look, these were not books for the average person. They were dense, academic, super experimental, and with them, literature took a hard turn, leaving the main road of clear communication and retreating into this kind of fortress, accessible only to a small intellectual elite. And the result was a permanent split. Before 1922, a writer like Shaw or Wells could be a huge critical success and be wildly popular. But after 1922, a schism opened up. You had popular literature for the masses over here, and serious literature for academics and intellectuals over there, and the two rarely, if ever, overlapped again.
Okay, so the rock has crumbled. What was it actually like to live in the world that was left behind? Well, the consequences were complicated and, honestly, pretty unsettling.
You see, the revolt against Victorianism didn't exactly lead to a utopia. For a lot of people, destroying the old certainties just left a big spiritual vacuum. In place of religion and empire, you got the rise of mass man, this individual who was often lost in a huge bureaucratic welfare state. All this led to a widespread sense of moral frustration and a loss of individual pride in your work, replaced by a culture of just sullen discontent. And you could see this new mood reflected in the arts. Ignoring, or even making fun of, traditional craftsmanship became a kind of badge of honor. Chaos wasn't something to be fixed or ordered, it was something to be celebrated. The very idea of anti-art actually took hold.
And with the rise of psychiatry, a new cultural obsession was born. Literature became fascinated with mental disturbance, with sin, with evil. There was this growing assumption that, well, everyone was a case to be diagnosed and that the world was basically one giant clinic.
This quote, from another Shaw play written much later in his life, feels almost like a warning. That Victorian effort to maintain dignity and order was replaced by what our source material calls barbaric loutishness. The whole idea of good manners as the grease that makes society run smoothly was being challenged and thrown out.
Which really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? The Victorians stood on a rock of certainty they thought was absolutely eternal, and it crumbled into dust. It really makes you wonder, what are the unshakable foundations that we're all standing on today? And how solid are they really?